Hello. In this video I will be showing you how to transmit video using the HackRF One and Gnuradio. We will be transmitting both analog NTSC signals and digital ATSC signals using the HackRF. You may have noticed that I'm actually running on Windows, which is a little bit unusual for Gnuradio users, and that's simply because, well, first of all, I managed to find a working, super easy to install binary for Windows, and second reason I did that is performance for me on Windows is much better than in a VM, so I figured since I could install this, I would do it this way. I will actually have a link in the description where you can get Gnuradio binaries for Windows because it's so convenient. It's just a one-click installer, you know, like every kind of Windows program, and it takes all the horrifying hassle out of installing Gnuradio, as you may or may not be familiar with if you've done it before. It's a pain in the ass, frankly, even on Linux, so just having it as an option was great. But yeah, so on the left you can see the analog NTSC signal baseband data, and on the right you can see the digital ATSC baseband data. This is actually the same video for both of these, so you can see the kind of radical differences that have been made going from analog to digital. As you can see, they actually both occupy the same bandwidth. It's about 6 megahertz. Actually, though, the NTSC signal technically occupies, well, maybe a little bit more due to the analog FM carrier, which is kind of slapped on the end. You can see it here. And also, as you may have noticed, I'm using the WX phosphor sync because it looked freaking awesome. But it's actually very informative, because we can actually talk about some of the things you can observe in the baseband here. So for the analog signal, this here is actually the video pilot, or the Luma pilot. So it's essentially actually a filtered AM signal where one of these side bands is being filtered off, as you can see here, and then this one is left. And it's a analog vestigial sideband kind of system, at least as far as I understood it. And then here on the right you can actually see the chroma carrier. Oh, and you can, by the way, see the signal freaking out a little bit right now. That's actually because those were pure black frames, so it was creating some interesting power peaking there, which is, you know, part of the reason analog signals weren't as good is because your content could dramatically change your signal form. But anyhow, as I was saying, this is the Luma carrier, and this is actually the chroma carrier here. So this is interesting because the Luma, or brightness carrier, is purely amplitude based, so this filtered sideband here will indicate, you know, brightness, and that's essentially it. Whereas this carrier here is actually a quadrature carrier, so it's much weaker than the Luma carrier and also takes up less bandwidth. However, it is having both its amplitude and phase changed. The amplitude representing intensity, and the phase representing the color. So essentially you're combining a brightness and color intensity carrier to recreate your image. And you can kind of see in this very fast-paced waterfall, you can see these lines here. Those are actually the breaks between frames of the NTSC video, because there's various sync pulses in there, and it creates a little blank spot that you can see. So I thought that was kind of neat. And here, of course, on the end, you can see the 25 kilohertz wideband FM audio carrier, which, like I said, is actually 25 kilohertz instead of 75 like traditional wideband FM, because this standard was made before the broadcast audio FM standard was, so they had a slightly smaller deviation on that. And you might have also noticed that I have a FM carrier amplitude slider here. That's actually because I can change the relative amplitude of the FM audio carrier. You can see I max it out here, or I put it back to what I have it set to, or I can completely remove it. But I have it at 110 because I found that leaving the FM carrier at full gain was actually hogging up too much of the power output, and it was actually bleeding into the chroma signal and causing weird artifacts and patterns and noise on the screen, so I had to turn it down, quite literally actually. And so yeah, I will show you that in a minute, but let's also talk about the digital carrier here. So this is the future evolution of the United States NTSC protocol, and they've called it ATSC. So the NTSC standard for analog television was actually implemented in something like the early 40s, I believe, and color was added in like 52 or 53 to the standard. And the digital standard came about in like 1994, but was only widely implemented around 2009. However, I think you can see how radically things have changed since then. Mostly what's interesting about this is how whitened this signal is. The content is constantly changing, however, the signal levels are relatively equal, so the peak to average power ratio has really been reduced a lot, which is really good as far as receiver selectivity goes and all that. It really makes the signal easier to receive and decode. I believe they actually found that digital broadcast stations could cover the same area with a far smaller output power than under analog television, and that's part of the reason why. But aside from that, there's really not much to talk about because the signal's so uniform, you really can't tell what's going on, and that's because it's all digital. It's all just bits whitened and mixed together. The only real thing that stands out is this little peak here, which is actually the ATSC pilot. So that's really just used by TVs to figure out, yeah, there's a channel here. It actually serves little to no purpose. It doesn't even do any kind of synchronization or anything. It's just there to mark out the beginning of the channel. The one interesting thing that there is to mention is that the modulation that this is called 8VSB, which is 8 vestigial sideband. And I already mentioned this key term today with the NTSC broadcast, but if I'm not mistaken, it's essentially the same modulation as the analog Luma carrier, except discrete. So the NTSC carrier is continuous, so brightness has technically an infinite number of levels that it can be at, whereas 8VSB stands for, 8 level vestigial sideband, so there are 8 amplitudes that our signal can be at, and once again, it is a filtered amplitude shift keying system with 8 levels, so effectively this is one sideband of an amplitude shift keyed signal, so in a way this is the direct digital counterpart to the analog NTSC signal, because this is a filtered continuous AM sideband, and this is a filtered sideband of an amplitude shift keying. So I thought that was rather interesting and also quite odd at the same time, because why would you do pure AM anything in any way, shape, or form right now? Especially considering that the competing format at the time was the digital video broadcasting system, T1, which is widely used around the world today. In fact, in almost every country, like minus Canada and like a few small others, I believe. But that used OFDM, which makes a lot more sense in my opinion, because you could, you have the many parallel data streams, which are much more resistant to things like frequency shifting and all that. But anywho, this is what we have. And yeah, so I've ranted at you quite long enough. Let's get right into how to do this. Just before we get into a demonstration, I figured I should actually quickly go over the flow graphs we're using. So this is the NTSC graph we're using, and it just takes the baseband data in here, filters it off, sends it off to this, where it is added to the FM carrier, which which I've implemented here, and then goes ahead and pipes it right off to your transmitter, or in my case I was using the phosphor sync to demonstrate it. And same case essentially for the ATSC broadcast, where we go from the file source, or actually UDP sources I'll show. It goes through all the steps of the ATSC encoder and gets added to the pilot and filtered a little bit, and then sent off to your radio or the phosphor sync as I have here. Actually, I should note as well, you may have noticed how all the modulation steps are in the graph for this one and not here. That's because I'm actually using a script to basically make the baseband before transmitting. That's because I couldn't find any good NTSC implementations for Gnuradio that I could get to work, at least. So I found VE3 IRR's Python script, which will take an image and turn it into NTSC baseband. So I used that. Quick note on the NTSC signal as well, since I will be demonstrating that script to you. It will take any 640 by 480 image or image sequence and turn it into a baseband signal.
Alright, so right now I'm going to show you how to do an analog NTSC broadcast using the HackRF. So as I said earlier, I got and modified this flow graph a little bit from VE3 IRR's SDR examples repository. I have it set to be reading from this file, and essentially you can go ahead and take any image and turn it into an NTSC baseband signal. So ideally I would have this as a GNU block, even at the very least a Python block, but I haven't gotten around to doing this yet, so I've just been using VE3 IRR script to do this. However, I have actually modified it a little bit to add the capability of video, which I will demonstrate here in a bit. So basically, here's the program. Essentially, you just give it the image file and how you want it saved, and run it. It creates a new file. Then we can go ahead back here and launch the program. And there we go. As you can see, it's now broadcasting. And as you can see on my TV. And so as you see here, I just have the HackRF connected to the laptop, and then the antenna just sitting as close as humanly possible to the TV. And you see I'm using a little wire antenna here sticking out of the coax port. And yeah, the audio is Pink Floyd's Time. I just threw a random song on so that there was audio for it to decode. But as you can see, it works pretty well. Alright, so the next thing that we can do is we can actually encode video using this script and broadcast that as well. And the way you would do that is you just specify your frame path. So like this would be frame.png, and I would once again specify the baseband file, and then I would tell it how many frames there are. So, you know, just however many you actually have. Now, I've already gone ahead and done this because at this moment in time the script's incredibly slow and does about 1 frame per second, so even a few minutes of video will take like 30 minutes to do. So I've actually downloaded the Simpsons movie trailer from like the DivX site or something like that, and I've gone ahead and used FFMPEG to break out all the frames into a folder here, and I've run them through the command line and created this baseband file here, which you can see is 6.5 gigs. So if you ever wondered what the pure uncompressed analog baseband size of an NTSC signal is, well, there it is. So anyhow, I got to change this now to the Simpsons file, And then I've also muxed out the audio using FFMPEG, so we can actually have both. I think that's it. Then we can start the broadcast again. You could hear the noise in the background. This one actually stresses the laptop really heavily, both in disk and CPU usage. So sometimes the signal will underrun and it will cause some freaky corruption on the TV. But anyhow, I'll show you that it actually does work. Here we go. This is a little bit more stable now, somewhat. As you can see, my CPU loads at like 75% and the disk's being maxed out by this. But hopefully this will work as I walk over here. But yep, this is broadcast in analog, NTSC. And you can see all the noise still. It's not a very clean signal. Simply because I'm using the wire antenna, and also the FM audio adds a little bit of noise to the color carrier as well for whatever reason. But mostly it seems to be a limit of my disk here. It isn't able to. So actually, I can demonstrate this analog signal being decoded on a real analog television that I got at Goodwill. But yeah, there we go. I see I've already gotten it tuned in. It's a little tricky to tune in here because we're through a few walls and the HackRF's transmitter isn't very powerful. But here you can see, let me turn the volume up.
Rusty, Barney, Lenny, Carl, it's in the movie event 18 years in the making.
There we go, now it's stabilized a little bit. Alright, I guess I jinxed myself there.
Fate of the world hangs in the balance.
So here now I've actually launched the analog graph on my desktop, and as you can see it's much more capable of handling it with no underruns anymore, and here it is on the TV, and with a cleaner signal as well, since it's much closer. I have the antenna right here. But let's check this out in slow-mo. Alright, so now that we've done the analog broadcast with the HackRF and NTSC, I figured it's only time to do the digital broadcast using the American ATSC standard. And I picked this because you can actually decode this on most televisions that are in people's home, like any flat screen will decode this still. So yeah, and this one will actually take an MPEG-2 transport stream as input and directly transmit it using, originally this was actually a EDIS USRP example, but I've adapted it to work with the HackRF. It works even better than the analog broadcast since there's no longer that massive drive speed bottleneck for reading that insane amount of baseband data. This one actually works pretty well, and here I'll show this successfully transmitting to our TV here in a second. Alright, so here we go. It's loading. And I've already hit scan channels on my TV earlier, so I picked up which channel this is broadcasting on. But as you can see, this is actually just a video I downloaded off of DivX's website and converted into a compatible MPEG transport stream. and it's broadcasting in actually 1080p right now. And on top of this, it actually supports full Dolby Digital AC3 encoding, which allows for 5.1 surround sound transmission, so you can actually transmit HD video and surround sound wirelessly. It's kind of cool. And here we can get up close, and you can see the quality is actually pretty decent. It's about as good as YouTube will let you see anyhow.
Kind of like a dream trip. Like it's not something everyone can afford to do, and it's because of snowboarding, because of what we do, that we could afford to do that.
Alright, so now we've done broadcasts from a file of both NTSC and ATSC, albeit not in real time, but video broadcast over the air anyhow. However, I figured, well, we've done this much. I am using Open Broadcaster to record this, so why not step it up a notch and live stream video to my television using the HackRF over a conventional radio channel. So I decided to embark on how to do this, and the first thing I decided to do was to try to actually use FFMPEG and Open Broadcaster in real time to essentially stream to a UDP sync and then use FFmpeg to convert it on the fly and stream it to this UDP sync in Gnuradio, or UDP source. However, I found that OBS had issues with saturating that UDP socket in real time, and it just wasn't working very well. So I decided to try streaming to a conventional rtmp server and then using FFmpeg to convert from that to the GNU UDP sync. And that actually worked pretty well. And since I didn't feel like running any virtual machines or dual booting, I found a Windows build of NGINX with the rtmp module in it that actually does run on Windows. And here, as you can see, I've already launched it, and it just, if you run it from the command line, it just sort of starts and hangs there and doesn't really show you anything, which is kind of odd, but it's definitely working. So the next thing we need to do is just start streaming, and I'm going to hit that. There we go. Now it's successfully connected to the rtmp server. So as you can see, I'm streaming, and you can have a look at my video settings. I've basically set it to 18.5 megabits because that's essentially the maximum you're going to get away with, because the ATSC broadcast standard has a raw bit rate after error correction and all that of about 19.3 megabits, and you're going to have muxing overhead audio and all that, so 18.5 megabits is the maximum recommended for broadcasting video. And then of course you got to start your FFmpeg encoder. So as you can see, I have quite the list of arguments here, which are all necessary for this to work correctly, because the ATSC standard is very, very strict on what kind of MPEG transport streams it's going to accept. So right now I have it set to go at 30 FPS, converting to MPEG-2 with the AC3 audio codec at 192K. I have the video bandwidth set to 18.4 megs, and I have the minrate and maxrate flags to keep it at constant, so it will actually pad out the bit rate or crush it down if there's not enough or too much data respectively. It's really important that your bit rate does not fluctuate because ATSC does not handle that well. And I've also set the ildct flag here because ATSC technically does not support 1080p, so progressive scan. It only supports 1080i interlaced, so this actually quote-unquote interlaces your video Then I have the muxrate here. So this is the maximum absolute data rate of our whole transport stream. And then I have it up going out to this UDP sync here. So actually we can go ahead and start this. Okay, there we go. Now we have it successfully transcoding the stream. So now I've gone ahead and enabled this UDP source and disabled the file source. And now we're going to go ahead and run the graph again. And while that loads up, and bam, there we go. You should be broadcasting live.
Alright, so I was actually having some issues with FFMPEG, and so I actually brought the bitrate down to 18 megabits maximum, and now the broadcast seems to be working normally. As you can see, it's running here, and you can see everything's showing up in real time on the TV, albeit with a few second delay in between due to rtmp buffer. So I can actually go ahead and demonstrate. You can like play a video or movies, so I'm going to use the same ski video again and go ahead and play that. And you can ignore any stutter, that's just my camera being strange right now. When the battery gets low it sometimes stutters, which is completely strange, but yeah. And as you can see, the quality's almost indistinguishable from the previous example where I was just buffering from a file. But yeah, and again, this is only broadcasting in stereo, so right now the audio is not in Dolby AC3, but I could also broadcast in 5.1 in real time. However, I don't really see an immediate need for that. But as you can see here, it all is working in real time with a few seconds delay. There we go. Yep. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this demonstration. Alright, and that's it. That's all there is to it. If you've gotten this far, thank you so much for watching this video. It's way longer than I wanted it to be, but it's really difficult to explain all this in a short, condensed manner, so sorry about that, but I hope that at the very least it was informative and you learned something and can potentially try this out. And yeah, so just leave any comments if you have questions or aren't sure of something or didn't understand something, or if you would like additional information. And you can also go ahead and check out the description for all the links to all the assets and files that I was using. I should have put everything there, so yeah. Thanks again for watching, and hope you have a good one.